In addition to the work of Darwin, we have many other kinds of examples from the living world that show us change over time in groups of organisms. And so I want to go through some of those examples. So for the fossil record, biogeography, convergent evolution, selective breeding, and homology are all different ways that we can see change over time in living things. And I'll be going through these examples in greater detail. So let's start with the fossil record. So let's just make sure we're on the same page about what a fossil is. So most people are familiar with your kind of classic fossil, which is when you have bone that turned into rock through various geologic processes. And you can see a really nice fossil here embedded in the stone. You can also have fossil imprints. So especially with plants, we have a lot of fossil imprints where it's just kind of almost like a sketch of the plant left in the rock. And the most broad definition of fossil also includes other remains other than like the bodies of organisms. So for example, and the footprints can be part of the fossil record and something that we rely on more and more. So the fossil record is not complete. And what we mean by that is it doesn't show every organism that ever existed. And in fact, it probably shows a very small percentage of the organisms that ever existed. And part of that is that the types of organisms that preserve is biased in the sense that, bony skeleton, for example, or anything that has bony or tissue or shells or really hard things are more likely to be in the fossil record than, say, a jellyfish. A jellyfish isn't in the fossil record at all, except for maybe some imprints of it. So those are various reasons why the fossil record isn't complete. But even with an incomplete fossil record, it still shows us how organisms change over time. And so two classic examples include Fishapod and the horse fossil history. So Fishapod is kind of the fun name for Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik was a fossil that was found relatively recently, actually about 20 years ago. And from the fossilized remains of Tiktaalik, we can see that it is what's called a transitional organism. Transitional means in between. So the Fishapod had the backside of a fish, but its head and front was starting to look more like an amphibian. So this is putting Fishapod in the middle or in between fish and amphibians. Now today, when you look at the living world, you have amphibians and you have fish. You don't have anybody that's in between. But the fossil record shows us this organism that used to be around that has traits of both. And so again, this highlights that organisms are changing over time. And in fact, at least in some cases, we have sort of these in-between steps where organisms showed the traits of two different types of organisms. Horses are another example where the fossil record shows us how organisms change over time. And the interesting thing about the horse fossil record is that it's pretty complete and it's well dated. And so one of the things that we can do with the horse fossil record that we can't always do is we can align the changes in the organisms with how the environment was changing over that same time period. So the modern horse actually the horse actually evolved in North America. This is kind of an interesting story because people oftentimes assume that horses came from Europe and Asia and originated there because you may have heard that the conquistadors, the Spanish conquistadors, brought horses to North America when they came over here in the 1600s from Europe. And that is actually true. There weren't any horses when the conquistadors got here, but that's because horses had gone extinct. So what happened with horses was they evolved in North America. After they had evolved in North America, they traveled across the Bering Strait into Asia, and from Asia spread into Europe as well. And then humans domesticated them across Asia and Europe. And in the meantime, horses went extinct in North America. So they had gone over to Asia and Europe. In North America, they go extinct. There's no horses there for a long, 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 long time until the conquistadors bring them back to North America. And obviously that radically changed, for example, the Plains Indians cultures because they rapidly adopted the horse into their lifestyles. But anyway, so back to their evolution. So this is happening in North America. And so the earliest horses had feet much more like a rodent. So remember, the horses are mammals, and they're close relatives of all the other mammals. And so they start out with bone structure in their arms that's really similar to, for example, ours. So we see individual digits rather than a hoof. So you probably know that a horse has a hoof, which is a single bone instead of multiple digits. So the horse ancestor had these individual digits, and it was small. And if you look at its leg structure in the back, it's kind of more like a rodent or a cat or a dog, fitting with that kind of sort of small animal lifestyle. And so in North America, where this animal was living, it was a woodland or a shrubland. So there was lots of dense growth, and it was kind of going through that dense growth, chewing leaves and getting its food that way. The environment of North America began to shift where these horses were living. And the big change was that it dried out. So it dried out and became more of a grassland. So it couldn't sustain shrubs and trees anymore. It was a grassland. And grass is something that organisms can live on. Not all organisms, but some organisms can live on. But it is not very nutrient dense. And so in order to get enough nutrients to survive on this grassland, the horse was going to have to travel further distances, and it was going to have to chew its food a lot more. And so throughout the remaining period of horse evolution, which this is a sampling of, okay, we see modifications that help it travel long distances across grassland and chew that grass a ton to get the nutrients out of it. And so we see the leg bones get longer, the body get taller and bigger to travel those long distances. We see the digits disappearing and becoming fused bone. That would become the hoof, again, for this traveling across the grasslands. And we see the molars become more and more better adapted to chewing up that grass to maximize the nutrients that could be accessed out of it. So again, this shows us how organisms change over time. Another place where this can be demonstrated is through the study of biogeography. So biogeography is how living things differ in their distribution based on geography. And so this can include both modern species and extinct species. So for biogeography, it oftentimes focuses on isolated continents, so continents that had a different evolutionary history than the other continents. And the one that's usually this is most important for is Australia. So Australia separated from the other continents first. So when all the other continents were still together, Australia split off of it. So it has had a longer time in which it was not sharing organisms with other continents. And so you see different evolution occurring there. And then islands. Again, as we've talked about, islands are a little bit special because they arise and they have to be colonized by organisms from the mainland. And so they can end up with their own distinct species. So the result of isolated continents and islands is that you oftentimes end up with endemic species. So an endemic species is unique to an area. So you have endemic species on lots of islands. So remember the finch example, each island has an endemic species of finch. Again, that means a species unique to that particular location. So that's an example of biogeography. There are lots of other examples. So another example here is relates to the fox. So this is in California. So there's California, and then you see this island right here that's just off the coast of California. So remember, when you have an island, the way that the island gets settled is when organisms move to the island from the mainland. So a fox can't swim from a mainland. So the way that the fox first got to the islands is through an ice bridge. So back during an ice age, there was an ice across this area. And so because of the ice, the foxes could walk across that ice from the mainland to the island. And they could also walk back, right? So let me move over here just for, right? So as long as there was ice, foxes could move back and forth between the mainland and the island. And as long as they could move back and forth, they stayed the same organism, right? So you had foxes here. They could breed with each other. They could mate with each other. So this was the same type of fox. But the ice age ended, right? And so when ice ages end, lots of ice melts. And so today there's no ice bridge between this island and the mainland. And so what happened is that some foxes got stuck there and had to stay, and they would change over time into a different species. So today we have the island fox and the mainland fox as distinct populations because they can't move back and forth. In Australia, we also see some unique things because it's an isolated continent. So again, we used to have this big, massive land that was all the other continents. Well, maybe not all of them, but most of them. And then Australia separated first. Okay, so organisms, animals were able to move back and forth between all of these areas except for Australia. Okay, and so what happened is that when they were together, so back when they were together, mammals evolved. So the first mammals evolved. Okay, so Australia and the other continents, everybody gets the earliest mammals. But then what happened is Australia separated. So here is Australia. And the big trait that arose after Australia was separated was placental mammals. These are sort of your classic true mammals, or sometimes called true mammals. We are a placental mammal. Rabbits are a placental mammal. Dogs. All of the mammals that give birth to offspring that can be on their own, right? And we can compare this to, so versus the marsupials. So a kangaroo is a marsupial. It has to carry its offspring in a pouch because the offspring isn't well developed enough when it's born. And so placental mammals arose in all the other continents, right? So all the other continents were still together. Australia didn't get any placental mammals because it was already separated. And so there are no native placental mammals in Australia. There's been lots of ones imported now, so they have dogs and everything there now, but none that were not brought by humans because of this difference in geographical history. So again, this shows us that organisms are changing over time because over here we got the placental trait and Australia didn't get that placental trait because back in that time period they were already separated.